The perfect metaphor for the journey of book to film, I think, is swimming the English Channel.
Hey CNFers, this is the Creative Nonfiction Podcast. Since 2013, this is the show where I speak to primarily writers about telling true stories. I'm your host, Brendan O'Mara. Look who's back. It's Glenn Stout. On the red carpet because his book, Young Woman in the Sea, How Trudy Ederle Conquered the English Channel and Inspired the World, re-released with a movie tie-in cover by Mariner Books. Young Woman in the Sea is in movie theaters now. And it stars Daisy Ridley. You know Daisy Ridley. Star Wars, other things. It's an outstanding book. And one that didn't sell well at first because it came out during the Great Recession in July of 2009. But it's one of Glenn's most remarkable books. And the happenstance of how this book became a movie is crazy. So we talk about the long road that led to this book being optioned and finally, against all odds, produced. What a trip, man. We also talk about book research and the ethics of writing biographies and how the universe sometimes throws you a bone. It's rare, but sometimes it happens. Show notes to this episode and more at BrendanO'Mara.com, where you can also sign up for my Rage Against the Algorithm newsletter, a short riff, 4 books, 7 links. It literally goes up to 11. Writing prompt, happy hour, first of the month, no spam, can't beat it, downgrade to free. That is a tight intro, CNFers. That's what I call respecting your time. Parting shot after the show on logging out, but right now, here's Glenn Stout, the longtime series editor of Best American Sports Writing, author of Tiger Girl and the Candy Kid, The Selling of the Babe, and of course, frog in my throat, Young Woman in the Sea. You can learn more about Glenn at glennstout.net and maybe hire him to edit your book. He's at Glenn Stout Books on Instagram and Threads. And away we go into the deep waters of the podcast. Riff. You know she's going to get across the channel eventually. And I remember the scene where she finally does it and the way you wrote it when she gets her feet back on the beach. And, I was hit with chills, even though, you know it's coming. And it's one of those amazing things that you're able to recreate with the story.
Well, it's funny because, in the film, that same experience happens. You know it's coming. You know she's going to succeed. And it's funny, you mentioned that. And yeah, they actually used that in the film, not to give it away, but you see her feet touching the sand under the water. I just thought when I was writing it that, you try to put yourself in the position of someone like her. And that has to be like after being in the water for 14 hours and your foot finally touches something. That has to be an extraordinary feeling. In the book's narrative, I try to bring that across. And apparently they decided to do the same thing in the film because it works there too.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I remember talking with David Gran a couple times and how he's able to tease out suspense in these historical narratives, and it sounds very simple on the surface in that we know how the outcome is, but they and their position don't, and so you're putting yourself into their subjectivity, and it plays out sort of narratively from there. And it goes to the thing that you've knocked me for about and a lot of sports writers do, whether you're doing a chapter or a set piece. Sometimes you tend to do the inverted pyramid in a chapter, and it's like, okay, that works for a newspaper, but for a book, we need to tease out the information linearly so it feels like a story.
Right. You have to, you can't give the end before the beginning.
Yeah.
As simple as that.
Yeah.
I mean, you can tease the end maybe, but you can't give it all away. Otherwise, why go through the experience? And, and there's various strategies you could use. I mean, it was really helpful for me in writing Young Woman in the Sea during the swim to be able to put timestamps from like press reports that were tracking her progress. And that gave it, that put time into it, and that gave it a certain pace and a certain immediacy that would have been difficult had those little timestamps that said, oh, she's 3 hours into her swim, she's 7 miles into her swim. If those wouldn't have existed, it would have been much harder to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so yeah, this has been a journey to get this book onto the silver screen. So let's maybe rewind the clock a bit and just take us to the first steps where there were rumblings that this might be adapted.
Well, there were no rumblings. Uh, it was it was in the spring of 2015. The book had been out 6 7 years by then, had been well received critically, but it came out in 2009, right after the reception. No books were selling back then, and this one certainly didn't. And I got an email out of the blue from someone asking if it was available for option. And I Googled that someone right away and saw that it was Jeff Nathanson, who has a real track record as a screenwriter.
Oh, he sure does have a track record as a screenwriter. Let's look at a few of his credits: Speed 2, Cruise Control, Rush Hour 2, Catch Me If You Can, The Terminal, Rush Hour 3, look, Pirates of the Caribbean, Dead Man Tell No Tales, and The Lion King, and now Young Woman in the Sea.
And sent it off to my agent. And I responded, yes, I forwarded this to my agent. And, that was kind of that. But, I saw that he was like real from the start. And I'd been queried other times by people who want to be screenwriters, want to be producers, don't have much of a track record. And you really don't want to get yourself tied up with something that might not be real, because if you give them 18 months and then, Steven Spielberg comes calling, you're out of luck. The property's in somebody else's hands. That's really what it started. And I've since learned, Jeff doesn't remember even how he came across the book, but I heard an interview with Jerry Bruckheimer, who said that Jeff told him he found it in a used bookstore. And he was looking for a story to adapt that he could write for his daughters,
Mm.
because he had two teenage daughters. And oddly enough, at about the same time, my daughter was a teenager, and Joachim Rennig, the director, had two daughters that were teenagers. We all had teenage daughters. I think we were all interested in doing something that would be for them. And anyway, that's how it all started. And Jeff already had a working relationship with Jerry Bruckheimer, and Bruckheimer signed on relatively quickly, and that got Paramount to sign on relatively quickly, and everything looked like it was going to happen relatively quickly, and then it didn't. The perfect metaphor for the journey of book to film, I think, is swimming the English Channel, because you can get really close to shore, and swimmers have, and the tide changes. And all of a sudden, you're not 200 yards offshore anymore, you're 2 miles offshore.
Ugh.
And that kept happening with this. Paramount dropped it, which is called Turnaround, so it went into Turnaround. It's not that rare that a studio will drop it and another studio will pick it up, but this did get picked up by another studio, and then they dropped it. So it went through Turnaround twice, which is pretty extraordinary. But then, eventually, Disney, a couple of years ago, a little over 2.5 years ago, I got the word, and I'd given up at that point because of COVID. I thought, well, nothing is going to happen because of COVID
Yeah.
with this. And actually, that ended up, I think, helping in some ways, because not much was taking place in Hollywood, and the actress they wanted, Daisy Ridley, and the director they wanted, Joachim Rennig, were both available at the same time, which I was told never happens. You never get the director and the star you want at the same time. And we were fortunate enough to do that. And, the budget came through that it could be done in Bulgaria, which has one of the largest film studios in Europe. Who knew? I certainly didn't. But it all just came together. The tide shifted, and once it did, we got on shore really quick.
Yeah, and given that it went through turnaround two times, what's your headspace as you're excited about? Oh, like, wow, here's this thing that wants to be adapted, and it goes turnaround. You're like, oh shit, and then it happens again, and then you're like, how do you temper your expectations just to weather the storm of the whole
Well,
process?
I tried to temper it from the very beginning. You know, even if you get optioned, you have about a 1 in 1,000 chance of a film actually being made. You can go on Twitter every day and read about writers, you know, going like, "Oh, my book just got optioned," or "Oh, my story got just optioned," and they're right to be excited. It's a cool thing, but don't expect it to happen.
Mm-hmm.
You
Mm-hmm.
know, it's in the same way that if you get a big advance, that doesn't mean you're going to have a bestseller necessarily. So keep your expectations low. Keep focused on the work you're doing. You know, there was only really one time where I really got ahead of the skis a little because I was told, "Hey, in a couple of months, be ready to go to Liverpool," and then it never happened. You know, literally one person had to sign off, and then that person decided to back out, and the whole thing fell apart. Even if it happens fast in movies is probably 3 or 4 years. So there was no sense waiting for something to happen fast. You know, I still had to pay the rent and, all that stuff. So I just had to focus on the work that I had in front of me. And, this was nice to think about when I had insomnia.
Yeah, what was that? Is insomnia something you've always suffered from, or something that it was an onset during this time?
Not really, but sometimes you just can't sleep and
Yep.
stuff. So this would be a nice thing to fantasize about and you know go back to dreamland.
Yeah, yeah. The last year and a half or so, sleeping has been tough. I call it the book panic. So you wake up and you're just like, oh my god, like, are you going to be able to make the deadline, or is this person going to call you back? Are you ever going to be able to call this person? Is someone going to put the kibosh on it? And then suddenly it's 2:30 in the morning, and yeah, you're as awake as if it's noon.
Yeah, it's sleep can be a challenge, but I've been doing it long enough now that there's always something else to be done, and I'm now accustomed to the fact that the hard drive in the back of my brain kind of never goes off. So I've learned, I guess, to ignore it.
Yeah, yeah,
To ignore it or give it a drink,
yeah.
and just go down to the end of the bar and stay down there for a while.
Yeah, here's a Quaalude. Go.
Well, back in my day, it might have been Quaaludes, but it's a little different now, I think.
Yeah. I think what's especially great about the timing of this movie coming out is it seems like women's sports right now, especially in basketball, thanks to Caitlin Clark's resurgence or emergence in college basketball and transition to the WNBA. Women's sports are really on the forefront in a way that they haven't been in quite a while, and an Olympic year too certainly helps. So I think it's just great that this movie really is it's coming out at a really good time.
Yeah, there's some real serendipity to that because I think Heart of Hearts, they really would have rather had it come out last year. But all this Hollywood schedules got screwed up last year because of the two strikes,
Mm.
so that couldn't happen. And as it turned out, gee, fortunate thing that it's the 100th year anniversary of when Trudy went to the Olympics in 1924. That the games were also held in Paris.
Oh wow.
So she should get a lot of kind of accidental attention throughout the Olympics because her story still speaks to athletes today, particularly women athletes, particularly swimmers.
You just talk about all the serendipity too, how the screenwriter finds the book in a used bookstore, and his daughters are of an age where he probably wants to write something that speaks to them and is inspiring to them, and just the those things that just have to align that are so out of your control for this good fortune to happen. It's maddening to ever insane to bank on that ever happening. So all you can do is, as you've told me a million times before, is like control what you can control, and that's your effort.
Yeah, that's the bottom line right there. Because if I'd have tried to stop everything and said, "Hey, I'm gonna have a book made into a movie and everything," I probably would have lost the house. I'd be like living, with my brother or something like that. You just can't think that way. You have to focus on the work that's ahead of you, no matter what. I think we've all been had experiences where we're like we're onto a big story or something like that, and it's so exciting. You want to get ahead of yourself, but once you get kicked in the teeth on that once or twice, I think you kind of get over that notion of depending on anything, because the one, you can control what you can control, and the other, I think, constant in this business is that it always changes.
Mm-hmm.
So what you might think is a sure thing one day isn't the next. You always have to be light on your feet, and you're changing up and moving to something else and doing something else, and it's a constant. You're just moving those cups with the ball under it on the table. You're
Yeah.
playing 3 card monte uh, with yourself.
And as the book is adapted, what becomes your role in the process, if any?
My role in the process is to basically be cooperative and stay out of the way.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Unless you're a Stephen King or a J.K. Rowling or someone, you're not going to be asked, in all likelihood, to participate very much in the screenwriting. But you will be on call. I mean, I had a small consultancy contract with them, and I guess over that 7 or 8 year period that the book was under option, 9 years, I guess it is now to this date, I fielded hundreds of questions, mostly from Jeff, sometimes through him for the director, sometimes through him for, the actors. And I just tried to be cooperative. You have to recognize that from the beginning, it's a collaboration, but your part of the collaboration has pretty much ended.
Mm-hmm.
You've given them the raw material. They make movies are a different medium. They're made in a different way than a book. There's no way to translate a book directly to film. No one can do it. Every book that goes to film is translated in some way into this other medium. And you just have to be aware of that and sensitive to it and open to it. Because it's not, not wanting, going, oh my gosh, you changed my word, you changed this. That's not going to change anything. That doesn't necessarily make a good film. So if you recognize that it's a collaboration and stay open to it and supportive of it, then I think you have a good shot. I mean, I think I was really, really lucky in that primarily Jeff kept me involved and informed the entire time. Not every day or anything like that. Sometimes it'd be several months before I'd hear from him. But when there was something I needed to know, he would get in touch. Or when there was a question that he had that he needed an answer to, he would get in touch. And, that even took place when I was in Bulgaria for a week for filming. There was an issue that came up one day I was there, and I got this rush like, do you know what happened here? And like, fortunately, I had the book with me, and I was able to like answer the question. And it's nice to feel that you weren't ignored and that they were sensitive to the essential portions of the book, which I think they were. I mean, the swim is presented very, very well. Trudy's personality in the film is the same personality that I discovered in the book, and her family relationships are the same. I mean, her relationship with her sister is really central in the movie, and it was also really central in the book. And one of the first conversations I had with Jeff, we discussed that. And I mentioned, like, boy, I was really happy in the first iteration of the screenplay that I saw that she and her sister were right at the center of it.
For those who the grand likelihood that they're never going to see their work translated to the screen, as much as that is kind of the dream for people to see their work visualized in that sense. What was the experience like for you, just being able to be on set and to see it come to fruition?
It was, I had no idea what it would be like. I mean, except for little bits that I'd read of other people's experiences. And like when I went over to Bulgaria to be on set, like I didn't know what to expect. And the first day I show up, it was actually in a building that had a swimming pool in it. And I go there and there's all these monitors shrouded behind curtains and everything, but there's a chair with my name on it. And then, people come around and introduce themselves, and I find out that I'm sitting 5 feet behind the director.
Hmm.
And I spent a week sitting 5 feet behind the director for 12, 14 hours a day, which was an education in filmmaking that, you could probably you could probably drop $200,000 on a master's program and not get 1/10 of what I learned in that 1 week just from observing. And that's what I tried to do when I was there, was just observe. Speak when you're spoken to. Everybody was really nice, but I made sure they're working, man. I'm not getting in their way. Uh, that's they're working. I'm not getting in their way. If they need me for anything, I'm here. That's the approach I took. Other than that, I was just like a camera. I was watching everything, just like soaking it all in. And like I said, the days were really long, probably 14 hours every day. But I got to see how a movie is made. you know,
Yeah.
you get to see some. In one instance, I think the scene that I saw shot the most times was a scene where they were doing some pan shot up Daisy Ridley's arm while she's laying in bed in her steam room, and the ship is, I think, coming back to America. And I bet they shot that 15 times. One time there was the fold of the sheet was in the wrong place. Another time, she scratched her nose, whatever. And, that was hours, right? Shooting that over and over again. It's not in the movie.
Mm-hmm.
Not in the movie at all. So that tells you, I think, about the tedium of that, because everybody who is on the film, they say it's exciting the first time. They say it's not that exciting after the first time. It's kind of like first time in a Major League Baseball clubhouse is pretty exciting. The next few times it's just a bunch of guys in their underwear. And I think if you go on set a lot, it soon becomes pretty tedious because things take a long time. But it was all brand new to me, so I was pretty fascinated by the whole thing.
Yeah, it's hearing you talk about the tedium of it. It's a lot like book writing too. It's not glamorous at all. Like, it's very clunky and takes a long time, and it comes together over a long period of time. Sometimes in 12-hour days if you're in a real crunch. So it's yeah, the
Sure.
as you know, you saw a different kind of grind that you're very much used to.
And then exactly, and then also just the scale of it, the number of people involved. I mean, there were at least 500 people involved in Bulgaria with the
Mm.
film. And I saw the film last weekend at the premiere, and the credits run for 7 minutes,
Yeah.
and there's got to be over 1,000 people listed. And that just underscores the collaborative nature of the process, and how many people have to get involved, and how many fingers are in the pie. And it also underlines just how absurdly difficult it is to get it made at all, with all those people involved, and all the different, not just actors, but their agents and producers and film executives. And it's just, it's endless. It's like running some strange gauntlet. And I guess it is a 1 in 1,000 chance, because with that many people involved, so much can go wrong, so much can just cause it all to stop. But we made it to shore.
Yeah, what would you say in all the days that you were on the set was the most striking or memorable?
Daisy Ridley was pretty remarkable. She did virtually all of her own swimming, and most of it was in the Black Sea. Now, that took place after I was there. They had to do some shots from underneath the water, like where she's kind of silhouetted, and they had to do some night shots that they had to make use of a water tank on a soundstage. This thing was probably 75-foot square, maybe 25 feet deep, and they've got an underwater camera, they've got a camera on a crane that's shooting above. It's dark, it's lit in this way, and they've got a wave machine that's making waves that are like 4 feet high.
Hmm.
And she was in there for the better part of a full day, and filming shots over and over and over. That was like physically really grueling, and I don't think a lot of other actors would have put up with it, and she did so without complaint. You appreciate someone's professionalism when you see that, and you see the example that sets. There was this was not a Hollywood movie set where I saw any drama whatsoever. It was very, very focused. I saw one person get mad the whole time I was there, and they were mad at themselves. So I mean, that's the one that really stands out because plus other silly things. I mean, like the boat deck is on the back lot.
Hmm.
So there is no boat there is no real ocean liner in the movie. It was like in the back lot, like 50 feet from a major highway.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
but they'll block it blocked off, so you can never tell, and the attention to detail too of the sets and everything was just extraordinary. I mean, there's an underground pool that Trudy trained in when she first started swimming, and it was in the basement of an apartment building, and they recreated it on a soundstage, a full working pool. And what I noticed is the pipes in the ceiling of this fake pool had fake corrosion on them.
Mm.
Now you're never going to see that, but it was there just in case. Okay.
Yeah.
And that's the level of attention to detail that I saw everywhere. I mean, the production designer was extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary.
Yeah, when I watch DVD extras, which I always make a habit of doing because I love seeing how the sausage gets made with a lot of these things, and you see the attention to detail that will, by and large, like you said, go completely unnoticed by the audience, and yet, hours and painstaking research to maybe get like the right patch right on a uniform, the buttons
Right.
right.
It's unnoticed
Yeah,
because it's so good.
yeah.
If you notice it, they screwed up.
Yeah. It's like, yeah, to put all
If
that
you notice
effort
something,
in.
then it's like,
Yeah. To,
that's it.
yeah. So it
That's it.
blends.
Well, it's kind of like,
Yep.
when you're doing a book, man, I've done a lot of sports books, and by God, if somebody hit 305 and you say they hit 304, there's one SOB out there who's going to start his review on Amazon saying, on page 75, Glenn Stout said he hit 304 when everyone knows he hit 305. I can't trust anything else in this book.
Exactly.
Okay?
Yeah.
That's what they do. Same thing in a film. There's one funny story about the film, and this is like right. Uh, Disney had said they were going to do it, and everything is ready to go. I mean, like super excited. This is over 2 years ago now, and like literally, it's like the day they're going to totally sign off on it, and I get contacted. It's like there's an executive that wants to make sure this really happened. Could you send us like a half a dozen newspaper clippings? I was like, well, you could have he could have Googled it, but I guess if you're an executive, you don't Google. You have somebody you send them. So I had to go through, and 5 minutes later, I sent half a dozen, uh, pictures of clippings, and that proved to them that yes, Trudy Ederle was a real person, and she had actually did swim the channel.
Yeah. And she was I believe she was the fastest ever to do it too. Is that right?
Yeah, she was the
Yeah.
sixth person and first woman, and she beat the men's record at the time by 2 hours.
Mm.
And her record for women held until I think 1950,
Mm.
which is by far I think the longest that anyone's held a channel swimming record.
When you're thinking about seeing, this book that you wrote a while ago, and you see the movie poster, and then you go in there and you see it come to life. Forgive me for asking these questions of like, what's that experience like? But I have to just keep plumbing into what that's
Yeah,
like to see it realized.
I don't really have a box to put it in, to
Yeah.
tell you the truth. I mean, I had seen the movie before. I saw a rough cut about a year and a half ago. So I had seen it before, but this was like a link through my computer on, our TV screen here. The experience was so alien and remote to me. I don't have anything else to relate it to
Yeah.
tell you the truth. I'm sitting there, and right in front of me is Jeanette Hayne, who plays Trudy's mother, and across the aisle, a couple of rows back, is Daisy Ridley and Tilda Cobham Hervey, who play Trudy and Meg, and you're at the reception afterwards, and oh, there's Jerry Bruckheimer, and and at the showing of the film, Joachim Rennig, the director, gets up, and one of the first things he says was, and he's on stage just basically welcoming everybody and giving out a few acknowledgments, and and he I was like one of the first people he mentioned, and he talked about just what I really liked about that whole experience was hearing how everybody involved in any capacity at all that I talked to, whether it was an actor or Jeff Nathanson or Yoakum or anyone else, how they all talked about how people have to know Trudy's story, how important it is for Trudy's story to be known. Because despite my book and a couple of others, her story is still almost unknown. And she's a real essential figure in not just the history of women's sports, but the history of women. Because, before Trudy did this, you could still make the argument that women shouldn't compete, that they shouldn't be athletic, that they can't be athletic. But once she did this, I mean, to use the metaphor, it blew that argument out of the water.
Mm.
And now it still didn't happen overnight or anything, but that was proof positive that women can do anything. And also proof positive that, hey, guess what? Some things they can do better, because she did break the record by 2 hours. Now, she used a stroke that no one else was using. I don't think a man back then would have tried to use a new stroke,
Yeah.
right? Men are wired differently. She didn't have any trouble with it. So that's, kind of what stands out of the experience, is to see how everybody was in it for the right reason, because this isn't a huge budget film. My understanding is that a lot of people probably took less than what they would get doing something else because they were committed to the story.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's like kind of getting back to that point of how there's an increased spotlight on women's athletics right now, and it's Caitlin Clark. I bring her up again. I what I like about her bringing attention, not just for herself in in her sport and her getting beat up right now, which is good and expected. I like that it's her celebrity is shining spotlight on just how good everybody else is that everyone was
Sure.
ignoring, like Breanna Stewart, Ionescu, so many Aaliyah Boston, so many other great athletes, and because of her, we're starting to see how great the others are.
Yeah, you're tuning in to see Caitlin Clark and you're seeing everybody else. And I think, Trudy, it was kind of the same thing, when she was first swimming. Um, and women swimming at the very beginning had a lot of fans, because it was like, oh my gosh, they're not dressed in swimming skirts down to their ankles. You know, People would attend for the cheesecake factor in some sense, and then realized they were seeing, women doing these some, Trudy did some long distance ocean swims and things. They might go there for thinking they were going to get to see women in swimsuits, but what they saw was women doing things they couldn't do themselves.
Yeah, and I remember in some of our conversations before about just the writing of Young Woman in the Sea, and there was family pushback that you had to navigate, and that's something I think that a lot of people who might write biography run into. So it's how do you
Sure.
navigate that, and even persevere in the face of that when you're like, oh, do I have any right to be telling the story?
Well, yeah, I mean, I felt I did have the right, because at that point, no other book had been done. I didn't know it, but at that time, one member of the family was working on her own book, which ended up being published. And it's a fine book. It's different than mine, but it's fine. But since then, beginning a couple years ago, a member of the family reached out and said to me, we know the family put you off 20 years ago. We think that was a mistake, and our relationship is good and cordial now. They're supportive of the film and everything else, because they too don't want Aunt Trudy, as they all call her. They don't want Aunt Trudy to be forgotten. And I've shared things with them that I've discovered, that I found this wonderful picture of Trudy at age 15 a couple months ago, where she has hair down to her waist, and she was a competitive swimmer then. She looks so confident. It's just an extraordinary picture. She looks nothing like the pictures we generally see of her, which is where her hair is much shorter and she's just been swimming in the channel, so she's usually, her face is bloated from the salt and jellyfish and all that stuff. She just looks like an entirely different person. And I took some copies of that picture with me to to the premiere and was able to give out a couple of copies to important people there, including the young girl who played young Trudy in the movie. And it was great to see that reaction where you recognize, you could see her recognizing herself in that picture.
In some of our conversations and emails over the last couple years, we often talk about research, and in a very internet home office kind of way, people have they've lost the a research muscle has truly atrophied or hasn't even been developed in the first place. And so what are some great research tactics that people need to know to fully flesh out their stories that might not involve a Google or even newspapers.com?
Yeah. Well, I mean, newspapers.com for history is really kind of key.
Yeah.
And I actually I was working on a story with someone last year, and they actually asked me if I could write up a guide to how to look up things on newspapers.com, because whether you're searching online anything, you have to be aware of all the spelling variants because, it's people just don't spell everything the same way every time,
Yep.
or machine readable text doesn't always read it the same way every time. One of the most spectacular research finds I've ever had was when I was writing the book about Fenway Park, Fenway 1912. And it was at the end of a whole day where I was searching in Google Books for various iterations of Fenway Park. Of course, it wasn't called Fenway Park when it was being built. So I'm like searching Boston Ballpark, Ballpark Boston, all these different variations. And somewhere I'd seen where they called the ballpark a baseball plant,
Hmm.
like it was a factory. And I'm searching on Google Books, and there's one line that comes up from an index of engineering magazines from 1912 or 1913, because I think the park had already been built then, and it referred to Boston baseball plant. One line. I found that. I knew we had that magazine at the library because I'd worked there. I found it, and it was a 4-page spread that includes the only architectural drawings of Fenway Park that still exist, and photographs of the park under construction, and technical specifications on how it was done. That's half my book right there in those 4 pages.
Mm.
And that came after, months and months and months of just looking. What can I find? What can I find? And mostly you find nothing until you find something. Uh, and I'm convinced that, at a certain point, the universe, when you're doing this, says, okay, you've done enough work. We're gonna throw a few gimmies to you. And if you've put in the work, then suddenly it's like iron filings to a magnet, and suddenly really interesting key information just kind of finds you.
Yeah.
You're not looking for it and start finding things. um, and I've talked to a lot of other writers who have that experience, and I fully believe in it. So that's the kind of thing, you just don't know where things are going to be, so you have to look everywhere you can think of and ask other people. And there's usually, at institutions, whether it's a library or museum or something like that, there's usually somebody there who knows where the things are that aren't in the catalog. Okay, they've worked there a long time, they know where the bodies are buried.
Yeah.
When I was at the Boston Public Library, by the end of my time there, I was kind of that person. You could come in looking for something, can't find anything. I knew the collection well enough then. I knew where you could find things that you're not going to find in the card catalog. It's just that simple. Not everything is cataloged.
Yeah.
You have to know what are in certain collections. And so that's hugely important.
Yeah, what's been a trip for me and kind of disconcerting in a way too is it finding things that you almost didn't know were there and the stuff you already curated. And like I've read this Prefontaine Sports Illustrated profile from June 15th, 1970 issue of Sports Illustrated dozen times. But until like I had a different set of glasses on, I didn't realize that some key motivation was like right there in that story the whole time. And
Mm-hmm.
it's just kind of it's pretty trippy, and also sometimes exciting but also disconcerting that you've missed it the entire time and it was staring you right in the face right from the start.
Yeah, right. And everybody has to have their own strategy on how to keep track of all that stuff, I mean, I know there are people that use various programs and elaborate programs and filing systems and all that stuff, and it works great for them. I think I've told you this before. I'm a I put things into piles and in folders,
Mm-hmm.
and I use a highlighter. I make hard copies on everything. That works for me. That's the process I'm used to. But you do over time, over the year or two it takes to write a book, you read all that stuff over and over and over again, and you start, just realizing what's special, and then you realize what your gaps are, and then you have to research those gaps. You have to go from macro to micro. You have a basic outline, and then you're going down and you're going to more and more detail. And even when you start writing, like, I have never ever been able to do all my research before writing. There's just too much of it. I'll get to this second paragraph and realize, oh, I just mentioned a building. I don't know what that looks like. What's that building look like?
Mm-hmm.
Or, where exactly is that in town? And I have to stop and I have to go look at it. And that happens over and over and over again, because you don't know if you're going to need that little bit of information. In Tiger Girl, there was one there where Margaret and Richard, the two gangsters, when they first got married, where they lived. And it was pretty late in the process. I said, I never looked up that building. I looked up that building, and there's a story that, like, everybody who lived in the building had been busted for drugs. So, like, oh, they're living in a drug den. That's interesting to know, stuff like that. You just, you never know what you're going to find. And with Trudy, it's the same way. The one of the big things in the book is that her first coach, when she tried to swim the first time, she thinks her first coach poisoned her. Now, this was kind of alluded to in a lot of the papers and stuff, but she never really spoke about it directly, except, and I found one reference to it, she talked to somebody from the Harvard Crimson,
Mm.
the newspaper from Harvard, and she mentions it directly that she thought she was poisoned. Now, why did she talk to the Harvard Crimson and no one else? Well, she's probably talking to somebody her own age.
Yeah.
She's talking to some 21-year-old guy. And she let down her guard a little bit and talked about it openly. And it was nice to really pin that down, to not say that, like, well, she thought it happened, but to have her say directly that she believed it happened. And I've since talked to her family, and they say that her whole life she was pretty convinced that she'd been poisoned the first time for the first swim, because Wolf, the first coach, he had quite a constituency of swimmers that he was training, and a lot of women swimmers. And once one woman made it, most of those people would have stopped trying, because there was a real thing on being the first. If you're the first, you're going to be able to cash in. If you're the fifth, it's not such a big deal.
Well, when you said being first, you're able to cash in. It makes me think of even kind of used this term earlier, kind of the ethics of biography and being able to write about let's say a public figure, and it is there is to some extent that the writer does benefit from trying to tell someone else's story for their own gain. And I wonder if that's something you kind of just wrestle with yourself. And here you were telling Trudy's story, and it is for some extent to keep her name alive, and so people don't forget her. But it is also something that benefits you at the
Sure.
cost of the
Well,
family.
I think in terms of Trudy, it was, her story was so important that I just felt it had, I was the first one to say, this has to be told. Why don't we know this? This has to be told. The interesting thing is, she was still alive when I first thought of doing the book. I had no idea she was still alive. Now, at that point, she was well into her 90s, and I think she spent the last few years, in a facility. And then by the time I actually started working on the book, she'd passed away. But she'd had, opportunities to tell her story, and had just never done so. She'd written, I guess, about 70 or 80 pages of her own biography at one point. But, she was a pretty private person and, not a professional writer. And, if you're in this business all the time, we always hear from people who aren't professional writers who think they have a book in them. And it's like, well, you might have 10 pages, but you probably don't have a book. And it just really needed to be told. And I did have some people early on tell me, well, you were allowed to tell that story, myself, but they didn't allow a woman to tell the story. Well, as far as I've ever been able to determine, like, no one ever really tried to tell the story before, like, ever.
Yeah.
It just sat there. And so I don't feel guilty at all about being the one that found it and that brought it to the attention of other people, because it was there for the taking for almost 100 years.
Yeah.
And I did the work to find it. I did the work not just to find it, but then I did the work behind it to prove that it needed to be done, and to convince a whole publishing company of that,
Yeah.
and to convince an editor of that, and convince an agent of that. That's a lot of work. So I don't feel guilty for taking someone else's story. Maybe someone else could have told it better. Maybe someone else would have told it differently. It would certainly be told a little differently today because there are more sources of information available now. No, I don't think anything that would dramatically change the story. History is cumulative, so that's why you can write about. People are still writing about Babe Ruth because you find out different information, and you can retell that story, and it's slightly different and it's fresh. And maybe someday someone will do that with Trudy. I'd love to see a documentary treatment of her story, as well as the traditional film treatment. I think that could be really interesting, but we'll see about that, because it's not just stories could be presented a number of different ways. I've written this in a juvenile book called Yes She Can, which is about five different female sports pioneers, and I tell a very short version of Trudy's story in about 5,000 words for a younger audience. Someone 8 or 9 years old who's a precocious reader could read her story in those books. So same story, different audience, different goal. There's a lot of different ways to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, there's a moment I heard, Jeff Pearlman talk about, he had, for his Bo Jackson biography, he had lobbied Bo to be a part of the process, and Bo said, by all means, if you're going to write a book, go write a book, but I'm going to sit this one out. And, and then I think Bo tried to put like a gag order on a lot of book events for Jeff in Alabama and everything. But it gets to the point of feeling, I think Bo probably felt exploited here by someone else writing about his story and researching his story. And I think every biographer kind of crosses that bridge at some point, especially
Yeah.
with a living
Well, I
writer.
didn't have to, I didn't have to deal with it because she wasn't living, so she couldn't protest herself. Her nephew that I first contacted just told me straight out, because I my offer to them was, if you'll share whatever resources you have, I'll make copies of everything I come up with and give it to you. And I think he was kind of misinformed. He was like, you don't have anything, we have everything.
Mm-hmm.
Well, all they had was some scrapbooks. And I got probably 5,000 documents at this point, from old newspapers to Olympic reports and things like that. So, but I don't, someone had to tell her story, and quite frankly, if it wouldn't have been done now, maybe it wouldn't ever have been done. Maybe everyone would have leapfrogged her again and focus on some other older athlete and write about them instead.
I loved the book when I read it, several years ago at this point, and yeah, it's so great to see it, adapted so it gets put in front of an entirely new audience, and it's got that really riveting
Well, and
cover too now.
yeah, that is actually the day we're recording this. The new cover which is from the movie, that's out today. So hopefully, the book that very few people read when it first came out will the movie will now lead them to the story, and the story will lead some people to the movie, and cumulatively, I think it's going to lead a lot of people all over the world, because this is getting an international release. They'll be led to this really essential story in the history of women, and the history of women's sports. That's will be a revelation to virtually everyone.
Yeah, it's wonderful when you can look back 100 years and draw inspiration that feels very prescient today, and her story does that.
Yeah, absolutely. And you brought up Caitlin Clark, and that was a great comp because she has drawn all this attention towards women's sports all of a sudden in a way that hasn't been present before, or hasn't been present for very long. And everybody's having a moment right now, and it's nice that that Trudy can be part of that moment, because that's a moment that she very much was at the beginning of.
Oh, excellent. Well, Glenn, as always, it's always great to talk shop on the show, and then call attention to the cinematic release of this wonderful book that you wrote. So you just, as always, thanks for coming on the show and talking shop and talking Trudy.
Well, thanks very much. And if people miss it in theaters, it will start streaming sometime this summer, probably in advance of the Olympics, and will be then available forever on your on whatever streaming service, on Disney streaming service.
Awesome. Thanks to Glenn, and thanks to you, kind listener, for making it this far. Crazy. Downloads for the show have literally been cut in half in the last month. Again, I don't know why. It's funny. I've been fretting about it, because it's a significant amount. Like, going from now, I think I announced last time, it was like from 9,000-ish a month to 7,000 a month, and now it's into the 5,000s in the last 5 weeks, which is, it's just crazy. I don't understand what's happening. I don't know. The thing is, I reason with myself that maybe it's just a bug in the analytics, and there's been no tanking of audience. It's just not registering through the back end. Whoever's back end, I should be looking into. Ew. I'm not as connected with growth as I am with serving the listeners who stick around. I try to say, in terms of newsletter audience or even podcast listeners, that I got enough. I act as if, you know what? It's enough. And do right by the people like you who hang out and glean some insights and indulge my insecurities and petty jealousies from time to time. That's why I put that shit all the way over on this side of the podcast. In any case, as some of you know, I have no social media on my phone and just use Threads and Instagram through the computer. But I logged out completely. Gonna take an indefinite leave of absence from that shit. Mainly because it invites an ugly side of me that I don't like. I get jealous real easy. I feel slighted very easily. I feel less than very easily. And I'm just done inviting that into my headspace. I feel weird saying it's better for my mental health, but it really is better for my mental health. Is social media, is it serving me? Hell no. Did it ever serve me? Geez, no, it didn't. The great mirage of it is that it feels like at times that it does, but it really isn't. Is it serving you, the listener? Me being on social media doing, I don't think so. Am I sacrificing gaining more audience? Maybe a little through luck, but I don't think so. Nobody reacts to a single thing I ever post on Threads, and my Instagram Reels only get the minimal amount of views. Like, you look at it and it's like 120 views, and it's like, oh, okay, so the levers of the algorithm are just not pushing this in front of anybody. And that's frustrating. And so why should I even put effort into that when there's a chokehold on its visibility? And sure, there's something to be said for posting that stuff in the event that someone might stumble across it, but, I'd rather, again, just not invite the feed, the infinite scroll into my head. I'd rather put my faith in people searching for creative nonfiction podcasts and finding us, or in you, the listener, telling your friends, or sharing it with your people, because we all have people. Podcast is like Snowpiercer, man. There's no stopping this train. I mean, we'll slow down and we'll let people on and off, so we're not totally like a Snowpiercer, but it's a perpetual motion machine that somehow stays in motion. It defies the laws of thermodynamics. But if I continue to make you happy, entertained, informed, broaden your taste, broaden my taste. Maybe throw in some crafty episodes, who knows? Maybe publish an extra newsletter a month. Yeah, that goes against what I often say is first of the month or once a month. But you know what? It might be worth knocking on your door just one extra time just to add some value. Might lose some people, might gain some people. Who knows? Like, I just want to be helpful. But in the absence of social media, how will you promote your shit? Well, this is the challenge. I'd argue that unless you're like super famous anyway, that promoting your stuff on Twitter or Threads or wherever, it creates an illusion that you're actually reaching people. This is the challenge. But this is the long game and how to do it. You, me, we got to publish widely. Always link back to our websites and or newsletter landing pages and build a body of work. Build authority. Encourage people to share your work with people they think will glean insights, maybe even in-person events, and pass around a clipboard. I'm not kidding. There's a great lyric from Metallica's Damage Incorporated, the final track on Master of Puppets. Living on your knees, conformity, or dying on your feet for honesty. Sounds way cooler when Hetfield's singing it with a monster riff. But to me, social media and giving into the great hoodwink is living on our knees, and raging against the algorithm is dying on our feet. Now, in this context, I'd rather thrive on my feet, but you know what I mean. I'd rather die on my feet, raging against the algorithm, inviting invisibility in the internet world, than bowing down to the great infinite scroll. So stay wild, CNFers, and if you can't do, interview. See ya.